All right. This is the American YAWP, chapter 28, The Unraveling. So, in this chapter, we're going to focus primarily on the decade of the 1970s, although we might stretch it a little bit earlier to the year 1968. And in fact, we'll talk about why the year 1968 is significant here. But generally speaking, when we think about the 1970s in American history, it was not a very good decade, especially following the prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s, the conclusion of World War II. The 1970s is perhaps, the worst decade since the Great Depression. The image that we're introduced here is an abandoned automotive plant in the city of Detroit. And this signals one of the big changes in the American economy, and that is the United States losing its position as one of the top manufacturing nations or producing nations in the world. In terms of what was unraveling, well, we can essentially point to three things here. One is the defeat in Vietnam. The Vietnam War, unlike World War II, leaves a much more kind of dissatisfied taste in the mouth of Americans and really causes Americans to question America's role in the world. Can the United States do good? Should the United States do good? So that's one. Another one is the largest political scandal in American history. And this, of course, is the Watergate scandal. It's the only time that an American president had ever resigned from the office. So this is also something that doesn't sit well with this decade. And, really the first economic downturn since the Great Depression. And again, if we think about just the economic period or economic history of the United States. After World War II, it was the affluent society of the 1950s. And even for all the chaos of the 1960s, the American economy was still doing relatively well. So it's, a defeat in foreign policy, it's a political crisis, it's an economic downturn. All of these things contribute to what many Americans view as the unraveling of the country or the unraveling of the United States. So let's start with the first point here in section two, and that is, really quite frankly, the disastrous way in which the Vietnam War unfolds and then concludes. So recall that last section we had mentioned, really the beginning of the Vietnam War as far as Americans were concerned. That came with the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin and the subsequent Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was passed in 1964. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had given the United States president, who was Lyndon Johnson or L.B. Johnson, the proper authority and resources to escalate the conflict in Vietnam. So, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there was no restraints in terms of how much the United States could support the anti communist forces there. And so, when we think about the Vietnam War in the American context, we really think of it as a conflict that begins in 1964 or 1965. Although we know from the previous chapters that the conflict is a little bit more complex, but the first major wave of American forces land in 1965, and really the most significant American troops withdraw by 1973. But when we think about the Vietnam War, it's really a conflict that we can point to or look at the Johnson presidency. So by 1965, already a couple years after, there were already some pretty significant anti-war protests that were emerging in the United States. We might say these were some of the largest anti-war protests in American history. So we'll say some of the largest anti-war protests in U.S. history. Some of these were getting upwards of 100,000 people. Now, why were Americans protesting the Vietnam War in particular? Well, we can point to a couple of reasons. So one, we might just point to the fact that a military draft was instituted during the Vietnam War, and those who didn't want to serve or encouraged other people to resist the draft, that served as kind of a big topic for people to debate over whether or not the draft was legit. Another one was the changing technology, and once again, the television strikes. The Vietnam War is sometimes referred to as the living room war, and that's because this was the first conflict that Americans saw in real time on television. And so we'll say about the living room war is that the television exposed Americans to the real time horrors of war. It was one thing to hear about, right? To like pick up a newspaper and hear about the people who had died overseas. So World War II, for example, television wasn't invented yet. So Americans were not getting an uncensored real-time account of that conflict. They could read about it in the newspaper, but there's something to be said about, someone grabbing their camera, going to Vietnam and just hitting the record button and having that portrayed back to American living rooms in real time. And much of it was uncensored. Americans saw the horrors of war unfolding in real time. And, this really shocked many Americans. One incident in particular was a village of Cam Ne. This was a village in Vietnam that was burned on TV, right? Or, it was one of the horrors of war that was portrayed right back to Americans. And so this had the effect of turning a lot of Americans against the war, seeing what the realities of warfare was really like. Another reason why Americans had turned on the war, or why, some of those were motivated to go out and protest, was because the conflict itself wasn't quite clear in terms of, victory and defeat, good guy and bad guy, so to speak. Whereas that was a lot more clear compared to World War II. So recall that in terms of winning the war, that Americans had adopted the use of body count. Body count, we'll say, was the measure, or as we know now, a flawed measure of victory in Vietnam. And so Americans questioned progress in Vietnam. In other words, even if the United States was winning, would we know it? And if the United States was losing, would we know that either? And, because the goals of the war, the measure of victory, was not quite clear for Americans, this was another reason why the United States really couldn't get, or some that were part of these anti-war protests couldn't get behind it. With that being said, though, a majority of Americans did still feel very strongly about preventing the spread of communism. The overall goal of the Cold War still remained, supported by a lot of Americans. But increasingly, there was this, as some might call, a vocal minority of people who were capturing the, headlines and attention. And some of these anti-war protests were getting, out of hand and violent and rowdy, and they became a major point for Americans to perceive on television. Now, there had, almost as soon as the Vietnam War started, there was already questions about it. What's the measure of victory? Is the United States winning? Should we be here? Um, but in 1968, the opinion completely shifted into another direction, and that was against the Vietnam War. And the very crucial point was the Tet Offensive. This occurred in 1968. Now, recall that because body count was the quote unquote measure of victory, Americans were winning from 1965 through 1968. And the perception was that the Vietnam War is going to end any day now, right? Every single month that passed, oh, next month we're going to win the war. Next month we're going to win the war. Next month we're going to win the war. And pretty soon Americans became disillusioned with that. When the Tet Offensive happened in 1968, that's when Americans essentially put their hands up and said, look, it's time to get out of Vietnam. Now, not everybody agreed on how or when, but by 1968, most Americans had turned against the war, and they decided that the Vietnam War needed to come to an end. The Tet Offensive, this was an attack on over 100 U.S. and South Vietnamese, we'll just say bases, by the Viet Cong. All right, so this was a massive attack. And the idea here was that, well, if we, the United States, if we had been winning for the first 3 years of this conflict, how could such a large attack happen? And once again, it was this point, we'll say at this point, the majority of Americans turned against the war in Vietnam. This was the turning point. Now, it wasn't just the acts of war that were being televised to American audiences, and seeing the bloodshed in real time was enough to turn many Americans against the conflict. But it was also the nature of the war. The Vietnam War was a guerrilla war. It was a war in which the enemy wasn't clearly identified in military formations or uniforms. It was a war in which it was unclear for the American military personnel in Vietnam who was civilian and who was soldier. And so Vietnamese civilians were prone to slaughter by the occupying American forces. And the most notorious and egregious slaughter of Vietnamese civilians happened at the My Lai village. The My Lai village, or the My Lai massacre, as it's sometimes called. This was where U.S. troops, we'll say, massacred hundreds of Vietnamese civilians. And this once again gets to a point that we made earlier about many of these proxy wars in the Cold War, in that when the United States and the Soviet Union are fighting each other indirectly over capitalism and communism, it's not American civilians that are subject to occupation. It's not Soviet civilians that are subject to occupation. It is civilians in these other countries that end up being, the battlegrounds for this. And again, the massacre of civilians was something that American citizens were not willing to tolerate, and only increased the demands for a conclusion or ending in Vietnam. Now, the disaster of Vietnam was so powerful that it affected American politics in a way that was really unprecedented, and that is Lyndon Johnson, the president who was, responsible for the major escalation in Vietnam. In fact, so much so that sometimes the Vietnam War is called Johnson's War, and Johnson was very committed to stopping communism in Vietnam. The unpopularity of the conflict ended his political career. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson, again, the same guy who passed civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the same guy who put in Great Society programs, Medicaid, Medicare. Ultimately, it was the Vietnam War that was the undoing of his presidency. And even afterwards, Lyndon Johnson was, concerned that the Vietnam War had completely tarnished his entire presidential legacy. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson declined to run for re-election. And, this really puts American politics American politics, but maybe more specifically the Democratic Party, because remember, Johnson is a Democrat, it puts them, right in the middle of an identity crisis because Johnson, being the Democratic president of the time, the question was, where does the Democratic Party stand on war? Well, a lot of the anti-war protesters would have associated themselves with the Democratic Party. So is the Democratic Party for the war, like its president, Lyndon Johnson, or is it against the war, like many of their protesters? And that's not the only thing, right? Recall from the previous section, there's also the question about civil rights. The Democratic Party had been for a very long time the party of the South, right? But the Democratic Party is also the party of civil rights. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So are the Democrats for civil rights? Are they against it? Are they for the Vietnam War? Are they against the war? In other words, that political party is a complete mess. This paves the way in the 1960 election for the Republican Party to come in and Richard Nixon, who wins the 1968 election. And Nixon, he positions himself against the chaos and upheaval of the 1960s. So let's just make a note. We'll say the Democrats in disarray. Nixon and the Republicans win the 1968 election. And so Richard Nixon is the president by 1968. And Nixon capitalized on a lot of the chaos and turmoil that was coming out of the 1960s. He positioned himself, or he ran himself, as the quote unquote law and order president. That is, Nixon promised order in a chaotic decade. So, for example, it's kind of funny to put it this way, but he was the anti-war protest. Nixon talked about a silent majority of Americans who supported his law and order position. So this was Nixon's voting base. And again, Nixon said and would say to the American public, he said, yes, things are looking pretty chaotic now with all these anti-war protests going on and 100,000 people turning out against the Vietnam War. Remember, you also have a lot of changes going on in civil rights. We talked about in the last section the emergence of other social activism, the feminist movement, the Black Power movement. So it seemed like society had been in disarray from the 1960s, that there was a lot of things that were changing. Nixon said, look, yes, there are a lot of these protests that are going on, and it looks like things are getting crazy, but that's really only a quote-unquote silent minority. The term silent minority is not, not silent, that's the wrong word. A loud minority. Yes, it looks like every day you turn on your TV, there's some protest going on somewhere. But in the eyes of Richard Nixon, that was only a small number of Americans, right? They're making a lot of noise. So they get on TV, they get in the newspapers. It might seem like there's, a lot more out there than there actually is. Nixon said, look, there's actually a silent majority of Americans that are out there, not protesting, not out in the streets, that are just living their lives, working their jobs, taking care of their families, whatever they're doing. And, they want law and order. And, this is Nixon's voting base to win the 1968 election. Now, we'll talk more about Nixon's politics in a future section, but here, let's focus on what Nixon said in terms of Vietnam. And that was, even for Richard Nixon and the Republican Party, the conflict in Vietnam had become so unpopular that Nixon promised an ending to the conflict itself, right? An ending to the Vietnam War. He called his policy peace with honor, and that was Nixon wanted an honorable ending to Vietnam. And for the most part, and this is the position that a lot of Americans had taken at this point, was that they might still have the desire to defeat communism overseas, but they just don't want American soldiers sacrificing their lives to do it. a common saying for the time, and you didn't have to be part of the anti-war protests to have this sentiment was, if democracy is so great, why don't the people in Vietnam fight for themselves, right? Why do Americans have to fight for them? So you could still have a position, and this, was Nixon's position essentially, and the silent majority's position was that, communism is still worth defeating, democracy is still worth defending, but in Vietnam, the Vietnamese should do it themselves, and that in fact was Nixon's plan or policy for Vietnam. So his strategy is referred to as Vietnamization, right? Vietnamization, and this is Nixon's plan to remove U.S. troops and replace them with troops from Vietnam. And so here emerged really kind of a gap between what a lot of the anti-war protesters were demanding and the position where Nixon was. And that is to say that Nixon was, we might say, well, not even, I don't even know if this would be entirely accurate, but Nixon, we'll say, wanted U.S. troops out of Vietnam. And the anti-war protesters wanted an end to the war. So Nixon's policy called for not necessarily an ending to the fighting or an ending to the killing or an ending to the violence. Nixon's policy called a lot more for just U.S. troops getting out of the crossfire. And this was evident from the policy of Vietnamization, where the war would continue, but would continue using troops from Vietnam. Not only that, but the nature of the conflict would also change. Nixon would remove American troops from Vietnam, but the actual amount of bombings taking place would actually increase. So at the same time, while American troops were being brought out, the war expanded in terms of its bombing campaign. Cambodia and Laos. So Nixon increased the size and scope of American bombing, including bombing neighboring countries. Of Laos and Cambodia. So one of the ways in which the Viet Cong was able to effectively fight American forces in Vietnam was by using Cambodia and Laos. These are two countries that neighbor Vietnam. They're right off to the left-hand side or I guess west. And so what they were able to do is they were able to bring in supplies from places like China, bring them in through Cambodia and Laos, and then smuggle them or sneak them into Vietnam. And so Nixon wanted to increase the size and scope of bombing, including the countries of Cambodia and Laos, which we might say Nixon increases the scope of American bombing. Countries, Cambodia and Laos. As they had supply lines. Now, this was without congressional approval. Talk more about how this ends up being significant in the long run. So the Vietnam War, even though Nixon promises this peace with honor in 1968, the Vietnam War itself doesn't come to an end. American forces do begin to withdraw, and the number of Americans is significantly different. So there are some who are very much satisfied with this. But as far as the anti-war protests are going, and for the most part, we're talking about young college kids that are part of these anti-war protests, they're going to continue, right? Especially with news that the amount of bombing increases. I mean, at least from the perspective of someone who is against war, right? If you are simply just against the idea of violence and the idea of people being killed, whether they're American or not, Nixon is not going to be your president, right? He's not an anti-war president in that respect. And so protests once again emerge or flare up on college universities, in the aftermath of Nixon's presidency. The most infamous examples were the protests that were held at Jackson State and Kent State. These were anti-war protests that resulted in 6 student deaths. And let's say from, actually, I believe the National Guard might be getting it. The National Guard and police shootings. I believe 2 people were killed at Jackson State, 4 people were killed at Kent State. And, once again, for as shocking as the Vietnam War was and, seeing people die on a battlefield, the idea of, young college students, I think they were all under the age of 21 or something like that, being shot and killed at university campuses, this was another, reason for, another reason for outrage. But eventually, as American troops began to withdraw from Vietnam, Nixon was very much interested in bringing a conclusion to the conflict. Eventually, that came in 1973 as part of the Paris Peace Accords. So the Paris Peace Accords, in effect, would stop, say, Paris Peace Accords will say ended the fighting in Vietnam, and Vietnam remained divided between North and South. Right, so this was more or less, more or less a ceasefire, right? An agreement to end the violence and the fighting as we see it. In the next couple of years, the Americans still maintained a relatively small presence in South Vietnam. One of the interesting features of of this was the United States had had a clause or condition in the Paris Peace Accords that if the violence resumes, then perhaps the Americans have an obligation or a right to re-intervene in the conflict. Well, in 1975, the conflict once again emerged. The North invaded the South, breaking the peace accord. And the question was, would the United States jump back into the conflict? Well, by this point, we've had the Watergate scandal point. Actually, I don't know. All right, so I just checked, and President Nixon, he resigned in August of 1974. The North's invasion of the South that started in December of 1974. So it is accurate to say that between the Paris Peace Accords and the resumption of the war in Vietnam, the United States had already gone through the largest political scandal in American history, and President Nixon became the first and only president to resign. So, in the aftermath of a Watergate scandal, the decision whether or not to re enter Vietnam, the U.S. did not re enter the conflict. In 1975, after the Spring Offensive got started by the North Vietnamese, Saigon, which had been the American capital in Vietnam, fell to communist forces. In 1975, Vietnam became an independent, unified, and communist. So, what are the consequences of this, right? Why is the Vietnam War so significant, right? So important? Well, there's a few things that we can say in terms of the consequences. As your textbook puts it, the Vietnam War poisoned American perception of their government, and the U.S. role in the world. Right, Americans came out of Vietnam, especially their government, looking at incidents like the Gulf of Tonkin, which was questionable in terms of what actually happened there, and looking at the way that President Nixon expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia. Americans became a lot more distrustful of their government as a result of Vietnam. And especially in terms of the role in the rest of the world, can the US do good? Coming out of World War II, it was clear which side was good and which side was evil. In terms of the Vietnam War, that was a lot more convoluted. Americans in the 1950s and 1960s had been committed to fighting against communism globally. But now there's a lot more questioning about whether or not the United States could do good or even should do good. That is not to mention things also too like the costs of the Vietnam War, right? It cost American lives in dollars. It was, millions or in the million, maybe, of Vietnamese. I think maybe 1 or 2 million Vietnamese were killed in the war. It was the damage that was done to the country. It was the cost to veterans after the war, right? The Vietnam War had a very real cost of life and money in terms of what was risked. And at the end of the day, the United States failed its objective of, preventing the communism from spreading. By 1975, Vietnam had become a communist nation. So Americans would reflect back to the Vietnam War and really, nobody was really happy with it. Those who were against the war to begin with said, well, we never should have been there. Those that, thought the United States, yes, we should have been there, they would point back and say, look, we shouldn't have fought this war with one hand tied behind our back. If we were really committed to preventing communism, then perhaps we should have used more in Vietnam. And so there was nobody really that was left satisfied after the conflict was over. And one last thing that we can say for this section, what does this have to do with the hearts and minds around the world, right? The rest of the world had seen the United States, right? In the same way that Americans were viewing the Vietnam War on television, the rest of the world was also viewing. And so in this Cold War, in this competition for the hearts and minds of people across the world, the Vietnam War did not, it did not help the United States win any of those hearts and minds. Section 3, racial, social, and cultural anxieties. So getting back to the title of this chapter, the unraveling, or the way in which it felt the United States was coming apart, this also applied to culture. Now, it's somewhat simplistic to say, but for the most part, there existed in an earlier era, namely the 1950s, a mass culture or a uniform culture. Into the 1960s and into the 1970s, you see a lot of these subcultures emerge. And by subculture, we mean maybe smaller, more unique cultural expressions. And this was even in contrast to some of the messaging of 1950s cultures. So, for example, a lot of this culture was about uniformity. A lot more of the subcultures talk more about, for example, things like uniqueness. You and I, to be unique or individualistic, right, might be another one. And so, certain companies even took up this idea of Americans celebrating more of their unique individualistic identity, identifying themselves with much smaller cultural niches. So, for example, I think your textbook mentions the company Volkswagen, who created, I think, the slogan "Be different" or "Be unique" or something like that, and that idea of be different that kind of gets to this notion of the subcultures. Now, there were a lot of people that also didn't think that the emergence of this new subculture or one mass uniform culture being replaced by many different ones, that was a very good thing. And so there's also a reactionary culture to this, to say that this was a bad thing. And one way that we might also think about culture in the 1960s and 1970s is that recall that for movements like civil rights, after the civil rights movement concluded, we had the emergence of these various other social movements, right? There was the, emergence of feminism, there was Black Power, there was Chicano movement. Um, and this represented in some sense a splintering. I mean, you could say unraveling, but a splintering of social activism. The same thing was true of culture, right? That one uniform culture split off into a lot of subcultures, right, et cetera, et cetera. And then a reactionary culture. So we have a couple of examples of this. So one example of reactionary culture, and that is a backlash against, some of the cultural changes, was the character Archie Bunker in the popular television show All in the Family. And this is Archie Bunker here, and it was a TV show about a family in contemporary American society with a lot of changes that were going on from the 1960s and 1970s. So we'll say about Archie Bunker. Bunker represented the reactionary white middle age male, maybe views on culture. And so he was critical of some of the emergent subcultures. Some examples of subcultures that emerge are disco and rap. And so we can contrast these. We'll just say examples of emerging subculture cultures. Disco was, we'll call disco interracial. Certainly maybe urban and optimistic. Now, generally, disco music, sometimes in the 1970s, is often synonymous with the disco era. Um, Generally optimistic about the music, whereas rap or hip hop, this was more African American. And we'll call it hyper masculine. And some of the first hip hop artists begin making their name in the late 1970s, and into the 80s and 90s, rap becomes more of a mainstream type of music. At the time, disco was a little bit more mainstream, right? So much so that again, the 1970s are often associated with it. But disco and rap are good examples of the types of subcultures that emerge. That again, if you were into those things, you would have been into the culture associated with it, right? So if you listen to disco music, you probably dressed like they did, and same thing with rap or hip hop. Now, the fracturing or unraveling went beyond culture and even into society. Now, this isn't maybe all that different from the decades earlier. The civil rights movement was a very contested period. But one thing that we can say about violence and civil rights was that this was no longer only in the South and was more publicly visible. So our textbooks provides us with two types of riots or two types of rioting that occurred in the 1970s that was more evidence to this unraveling of society. One of them were anti-bus riots in Boston, Massachusetts, a city in the north, and these were white protests against the use of busing, so I think school buses, I want to say, to quote overcome residential segregation and truly integrate public schools. Then we also have examples of urban riots, and I think we had mentioned these in a few other chapters. These were the ones that happened in Watts, Los Angeles. Watts riots, 65. These were the Newark, New Jersey, 1967. And these were Detroit in 1967. And these were Black protests as opposed to those in Boston, where the rioters or the protesters were white. As one Newark, New Jersey rioter put it, and a lot of the factors that contributed to these riots in places like Watts in New York and Detroit had to do with the deteriorating economic circumstances. Said, quote, "They tell us about the pie in the sky, but that pie is too damn high." Was a Newark, New Jersey rioter. The Kerner Commission was established in order to determine the cause of the riot, because again, as American onlookers, seeing people rioting and using violence and destroying businesses and looting, and this was reason for Americans to be concerned. And again, especially recall in the aftermath of the post-civil rights movement, Americans believed that race relations ought to get better, and incidents in these cities and places in Boston, it seemed as if racial relations was getting worse. So the Kerner Commission, this was set up to investigate the cause of the riots. And they said that it was racism and economic hopelessness. And the pie is too damn high. That was the cause. And it was somewhat of a bleak outlook as far as where the United States was concerned in the 1970s. Again, you might think you might think that race relations would have gotten better following the civil rights movement, but in fact, it appeared as if it had gotten a lot worse. And there's a point here to make at the very end of this section, and that is, the difference between de jure segregation that was addressed by the civil rights movement and de facto segregation. So de jure segregation, de jure means by law, right? So jury, law. And this was what was banished or destroyed by the civil rights movement or by the Civil Rights Act, right? 1964. So no longer could the law segregate between white and black, but that's also compared with de facto. And de facto means matter of fact, right? So it's not by law, but it is more of maybe like by culture, for example, right? It's just the type of segregation that people might practice in their daily lives or maybe within institutions. Matter of fact, I mean, this is what's called the segregation, which persisted. So even though the de jure segregation is banned or outlawed, there were still plenty of areas in which the after effects or the consequences of that remained important. So, for example, the decades of segregation in housing would still continue to have an impact in the future. The segregation in employment, for example, with things like loans, those things could all still be felt. And so your textbook makes the point that says, quote, the perseverance of stark racial and economic segregation destroyed the distinction between the two. And what they're referring to are these two types of segregation here, right? So the fact that the effects of segregation in housing, employment, and loans almost made it as if the de jure segregation, the fact that the Civil Rights Act was passed, that really this didn't lead to maybe as much found change as necessary. And, Martin Luther King Jr., and we'll finish this section with a quote here, kind of touches upon this point, right? He says, quote, "What good was the right to enter a store without any money for the purchases of it?" So this point here about the right to entering the store, this is talking about the de jure segregation, right? Where before they had white stores and black stores, right? Well, they don't have that anymore, right? So every store could be entered in, or no law could be made to forbid a certain race from entering a store. But the effects of segregation, right? Not having any money to purchase, this is the effects or the long-term effects of segregation, and encapsulate some of the de facto segregation that's still going on. Section 4, the crisis of 1960. So we had mentioned earlier that the decade of the 1970s is generally considered a pretty rough decade for Americans, and that's why this section is called the Unraveling. But I mentioned earlier that perhaps we could start at 1968 and take it up to, we'll say 1999. And here are some of the reasons why 1968 was an important year for several reasons. One, it's the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And his assassination led to widespread riots across the country. King had become, at that point, a beloved figure in American history. His success in the civil rights movement had made him a household name. And by this point, he was embarking on a campaign for poverty. The quote from the last section we had mentioned, what good is it to be allowed into a store if you have no money to buy anything? And, at that point, his assassination came as an entire shock to the country. Similarly, in 1968, that was also the year that Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, was also assassinated. At the time, he was actually running for president, and he represented, in a lot of ways, the ideas of the New Left. He was seen as, in some sense, the, sort of the standard bearer for progressives in the United States. He was against Vietnam. He was for civil rights. He was for welfare. And because, remember, in 1968, the existing president, Johnson, had withdrawn from the race, that, maybe Robert F. Kennedy had a really strong chance of actually winning this election. In 1968, he was assassinated, and that also put the the Democratic Party in a very difficult position. If we couple this with earlier assassinations, 1963, JFK is assassinated. 1963 in Vietnam, No Din Diem was assassinated. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. In 1972, someone tried to, they didn't succeed, but they tried to kill George Wallace, segregation forever. So, this period, the 1960s and into the 1970s, there's a reason why they call it a turbulent time period. A lot of the nation's leaders in terms of politics were killed, and that sends, the country into, certainly into uncertainty. While King was killed, Kennedy was killed. The 1968 presidential election is taking place. It's also a presidential year. Johnson withdraws. This is also the year of the Tet Offensive in 1968, and this is when Americans are convinced to leave Vietnam. And so in Chicago of that year in 1968, at the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago, and the sitting president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, he was a Democrat. He could potentially run. Well, he withdrew from the race because he supported the Vietnam War. Robert Kennedy was running for office. He is killed. Martin Luther King maybe even could have been a candidate for president. I mean, he stood on the side of civil rights. He was against the Vietnam War. He represented sort of this new progressive movement, but he was killed. And so at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, you had riots breaking out. Riots broke out on national television. And the idea was that, the country is in disorder and chaos. That is very much the sentiment that many Americans have felt. Section 5, the rise and fall of Richard Nixon. So, again, in 1968, the sense was disorder and chaos. And we talked earlier about specifically the Vietnam War and how that came to a conclusion. But there was also another side of it, and that was what was going on domestically with things like the anti war protests, the Democratic National Convention, the riots that were going on there, the urban riots, the anti busing riots. So there was a second part to this equation about Richard Nixon coming in and, using law and order, right? Not just law and order as it pertained to Vietnam, but also law and order as it pertained to American society. So 1968 for the Democrats, we already know that Johnson, he's withdrawn. Robert Kennedy, assassinated. And so that left the Democrats with Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey was, not really all that, not all that inspiring of a candidate. He was the former vice president, why, former VP. Third party had a very strong third party candidate, and that was George Wallace. And his Segregation Forever platform. At this time, the quote unquote Dixiecrats, those were the Southern Democrats. What were the Dixiecrats going to do now that the Democratic Party under Johnson, he was the one that signed civil rights legislation. And so for those that favored segregation for the time being and in the 50s and 1960s, they're going to end up voting for these third party candidates like George Wallace. So that's going to take a little bit of, a little bit of vote away from the traditional Democratic Party. Remember too that as far as the the presidency or the Democratic Party goes, are they for or against the Vietnam War? Johnson had been for it. Johnson was the one responsible for the escalation in it, but he was withdrawing because the public didn't support the war anymore, and he couldn't run for office anymore with that very unpopular position. So this is where Richard Nixon comes in with his law and order and his quote unquote, his silent majority, as we also use. Right. And it's promising law and order in a time period that feels like disorder and chaos that gives Richard Nixon the presidency. So for the Republicans in the 1968 election, Nixon. And Nixon, he was the law and order candidate. He'd been a former vice president under Eisenhower. Silent majority. Says a lot of people are protesting out there. You see those people on TV, but there's a silent majority of Americans that are out there that support me, Richard Nixon, and in my position. Of course, Richard Nixon wins the 1968 election. And Nixon actually has a rather eventful presidency. There's quite a bit he actually gets done, but it all becomes foreshadowed, or sorry, it all becomes overshadowed, not foreshadowed. It all becomes overshadowed by the Watergate scandal. And as we mentioned at the top of the chapter, this is arguably the largest political scandal in all of American history and has forever tarnished the reputation and legacy of Richard Nixon ever since. But when Nixon came into office, remember that, just in the last section, it was under Nixon that the Vietnam War came to an end. The actual bombing and the fighting didn't end until a little bit longer, but Nixon was very quick to pull American troops out there, right? Vietnamization, pull out American troops. So he was responsible for that, or partially responsible for that. But this coincided with Richard Nixon's overall approach to the Cold War, which is different, right? For the very first time, we have an American president that isn't quite as aggressive towards the Cold War as everyone else before him. And the ending of the Vietnam War is evidence of that. Richard Nixon followed a foreign policy called détente. And détente is, generally speaking, it's a policy of relaxation or deflation in the Cold War. Right? So, recall earlier in the 1960s under President Kennedy, you had brinksmanship, the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries on the verge of going to war with each other. Nixon wanted to relax things. That didn't mean that the United States was going to retreat from its commitment in the world. He just didn't like the very aggressive, maybe like warmongering type of approach that had preceded him. And he's really the first president to pump the brakes when it comes to the Cold War and try and relax and chill out the tensions between both sides. The ending of the Vietnam War is one example. Another example is his visit and normalizing relations with China. Right? China, remember, China had become communist in 1949. And since then, the United States never officially recognized China. Nixon normalized, meaning recognized, relations with China. And even visited. He's the first president, our first president in office, maybe, to visit China, or at least definitely communist China. It did. Now, it wasn't just out of the goodness of Nixon's heart. Communist China at that point was certainly had become the legitimate country or legitimate ruling party in China. But there was also a strategic point to Nixon building relationship with China, and that is, remember, China is a communist country, and the Soviet Union is also a communist country. Now, traditionally, they ought to be friends, right? However, though, the Soviets and the Chinese were going through a little bit of a rough patch, we might say. And so what Nixon wanted to do was to further drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union to make their friendship weaker. So, what would be better for the United States than the Soviet Union seeing their worst enemy, aka the USA, and China being on the same side, and that was again to antagonize the Soviet Union. Another great example of détente is the signing of the SALT treaties, or SALT I under Nixon. This stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This was with the Soviet Union. Once again, détente in action. So we think of the Cold War as the arms race, bombs, both sides spending a tremendous amount of money on their militaries. But now Richard Nixon is coming in and saying, well, why don't we roll things back a little bit, right? Why don't we relax the tension and the policies between the Soviet Union and the United States? And for the most part, we might say that Nixon had a relatively, successful foreign policy. I guess it depends on how you want to define it. There wasn't a catastrophe like the Vietnam War that unfolded under Nixon. There wasn't World War III that, unfolded under Nixon. So, you could at least say those things. Economically, though, and domestically, things didn't get better. And in fact, the economic crunch of the 1970s really began to hurt Americans. Again, the 1970s are the first time since the Great Depression that the United States goes into an economic downturn. And some of it is related to foreign policy and politics. So in the 1970s, OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So, OPEC. Petroleum, if you're not familiar, this is oil and gasoline. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, the United States had imported a lot of gasoline from foreign countries. Many of those countries were predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East. Those countries got together to form OPEC in order to better organize how they sell oil to foreign nations. We'll say majority Muslim countries that opposed U.S. support of Israel. We don't talk too much about the conflict in the Middle East in this section, or maybe even in this book more broadly. But during the Cold War, there were at least three wars that had broken out between Israel and their neighbors, and a lot more skirmishes in between. 1948, 1967, and 1973, and Israel went to war with their Arab neighbors. Now, because this was the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union both had interest there. As far as supporting Israel, the United States had been a very strong ally to Israel all during those conflicts. And so the fact that these OPEC nations, which were majority Muslim nations in the Middle East, who had, their allied countries had gone to war with Israel, three times, they cut off oil to the U.S. because the United States supported Israel. This in turn led to the energy crisis. And energy crisis was when oil prices increased times four. Gas stations ran out of gas. And the economy came to a halt. The United States at this point, they had come to rely on imports far too much. And when OPEC, cut off the US from oil, it really caused a lot of problems back home. And you had, during the energy crisis, gas stations that would simply put up signs and say, sorry, we're out of gas, and that's it. And you can imagine the detrimental effect that that would have on the economy, right? So much of the economy relies upon getting things from point A to point B, right? Driving trucks that are full of cargo. And the fact that, gas prices were going through the roof, that gas stations were running out of gas, it really had a big impact as far as the economy is concerned. And again, I want us to think about maybe this against the background of the 1970s as not being as contributing to some of the um, poor economic performance, right, or poor economy of the United States. If it wasn't bad enough that the United States was running out of oil, it was also exposed during Nixon's presidency some of the lies that previous administrations had told specifically about the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers, these were top secret information about the Vietnam War and how the public was misled and lied to. And so this only further contributed, and we talked about this earlier, a distrust in government whether it was the Gulf of Tonkin on President Johnson, whether it was Nixon expanding the war in Laos and Cambodia without congressional approval. It really didn't look good as far as the public was concerned. And you had already, as a consequence of Vietnam, and this really isn't just Vietnam. I mean, if we're keeping score or we're keeping track of the way in which presidential power has accumulated, really from Franklin Roosevelt. Recall that FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Deal. Roosevelt as an executive, he did exercise a level of power that, was, really wasn't matched. Of course, you can make the point that World War II is going on. And so, because there was a war, of course, the president had to make more power. And there certainly is an argument to be had about that. But even after FDR was in office, his successor, Harry Truman, he was able to wage war in Korea through the UN. And when we think about the war-making powers, who is responsible for declaring war? Well, it's typically the Congress, right? The president doesn't have the power to do that, but yet, because of the United Nations, the United States could kind of indirectly fight in that conflict. Then we go to Eisenhower, and yes, we talked about how Eisenhower didn't want to create any conflicts because he didn't want World War III to break out, and so he'd really been cautious about intervening around the world. But under Eisenhower, the CIA is very, very active in overthrowing regimes around the world, and so you can kind of conduct war through the CIA as as the president. John F. Kennedy, after Eisenhower, the Bay of Pigs. Now that failed, but again, that was another example of regime change without congressional approval. And then, of course, Johnson, who did get congressional approval, but didn't technically get a declaration of war. And the Vietnam War, with 500,000 American soldiers and lasting for, 8 years or whatever, you could trace a slow and steady progression of American presidential power. And one way that Congress sought to check that, and especially, when the Pentagon Papers were published and said, look, actually, by the way, we haven't been telling the American public and we haven't been telling Congress the complete truth about all these things. Congress looked for the very first time to check the power of the presidency, and Nixon's presidency does represent that. It's not just the War Powers Act, which is passed by Congress. We'll say the War Powers Act is passed by Congress. And this essentially reduced the power of the president to conduct war without Congress. The Congress is once again reasserting its authority over the president. The Vietnam War is the conflict that is in the most recent memory, but it's also going to be the Watergate scandal, which is what we're going to conclude this section in. And in a lot of ways, when you look towards Nixon, and Nixon continued to fight the war in Vietnam, but it's going to be after Nixon, partially because of the War Powers Act, but more because of the Watergate scandal, that we might say it's at this point, green, that Congress reasserts its power over the president. And that is one way to think about the Watergate scandal and Nixon's presidency, maybe in more so of the long term, right? You would essentially just had this slow and steady growth of the power and influence of the president, again, from FDR and the New Deal all the way through Nixon and the Vietnam War. And Nixon's demise or Nixon's downfall was not just the downfall of Nixon personally, but it was also in some sense Congress saying, hey, wait a minute. At the end of the day, with the separation of powers, it's us, the lawmaking body. We're the ones that hold the power to make war, and it's the president works for the American people. It's not the American people work for the president. So, what was the Watergate scandal all about, right? And how did it lead to Richard Nixon's downfall? Well, Watergate is the name of a hotel. So the Watergate, this was, we'll say, a hotel that 5 burglars, we'll put burglars, were caught breaking into. It happened to be the headquarters of the Democratic Party. So essentially, these 5 burglars were caught breaking into the headquarters for the Democratic Party. And part of what inspired the break in, the Watergate break in, was that this was the 1970 election. And Richard Nixon was running for reelection as the Republican. And so the idea was, or I should say at the time, there was, again, it didn't seem as if it was politically motivated. Just these random people breaking into a hotel wasn't really big news when it actually happened, and the story passed and the election went on. And in fact, Richard Nixon ended up winning the reelection. A little bit later, or at least to some journalists who believed that there was something more to the story, the 5 burglars, one of them had been associated with the CIA, and one of them had been part of an organization called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So maybe there was some sort of tie between the burglars and the, Richard Nixon. And of course, that became the major question, right? Was there some connection between Richard Nixon and the burglars? And again, at the time, not really too much news came about it, but some people thought that there was definitely more there, and they were actually right about that. Now, the break-in itself, it's believed that Richard Nixon probably didn't order it. He may not have even known about it, but what they were doing was they were definitely breaking in to try and steal information from the Democratic Party to help Richard Nixon. What ultimately did Richard Nixon in was the cover-up, and that was Nixon tried to distance himself as much from this break-in as possible. Nixon ordered the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, recall the CIA is designed to fight the Cold War, to interfere with the FBI investigation. And the FBI is to find criminal activity. And again, the question was, what is the relationship between the burglars and Nixon? And so the FBI was investigating that. Nixon told the CIA, "Look, try and ruin that investigation, interfere with it, so I can't be held accountable." And ordering the CIA, an aspect of the government, aspect of the executive branch designed to fight the Cold War and protect Americans, to cover up essentially your criminal activity. That's a pretty bad thing to do, and that's what Nixon was doing, right? He was using his power as the president to hide his own criminal behavior. Eventually, the Senate would open up hearings about this. And again, they would bring forward members of Nixon's administration and ask him, hey, does Nixon know anything about this break-in? Is he covering it up, et cetera, et cetera? We'll say the Senate hearings held hearings. To determine the burglar Nixon connection. And by this time, Richard Nixon has already won the 1972 election. In fact, he's won by a very comfortable margin. It's one of the more one-sided victories in presidential history. So it makes the Watergate scandal even all that much more complex, right? So, why cheat when you know you're going to win by so much? Well, at that point, the damage had already been done. And during the Senate hearings, when they're, investigating and grilling members of Nixon's administration, there's one guy that comes out that essentially says, yes, Nixon knows about it. But even at that point, it's his word against the president's. And, even if one person, 2 people, even if, a handful of people come out and implicate Nixon, it's going to be very hard for your word to go against the president's, right? The president's going to have a lot of sway in that position. But during the hearings, it is revealed that Richard Nixon and the White House actually record all of their phone conversations. And so the major key piece of evidence in the Watergate scandal are the Nixon tapes. These are the phone conversations recorded, phone conversations of Nixon, and would determine guilt or innocence. Right? This will provide everything that the public wants to know. The Senate demands that Nixon turn over the tapes. Nixon refuses. It eventually goes before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court orders that Nixon has to turn over the tapes. Nixon is willing to turn over edited versions of the tapes. He won't hand over the entire tapes. And so Nixon's not cooperating with the investigation. He is not handing over the tapes. He's claiming executive privilege, right? He is the president. He doesn't have to send it over. And so it's at that point at Nixon's in cooperation that Congress begins articles of impeachment. We'll say Congress begins impeachment. And I say begins because they're never actually able to technically impeach Nixon. And that's because, say before, they can. Congress begins impeachment before they can finish. Nixon resigns. Right, Nixon resigns. So technically, Richard Nixon was never impeached. Congress was about to impeach him, but Richard Nixon resigned or quit before he could, before he could do that. Now, when it was all said and done, his successor, Gerald Ford, who was the vice president, now president, so we'll say president, and he serves from 1974, the rest of Nixon's term until 1996. He grants Richard Nixon a pardon, and that is 2 pardons of all criminal charges. Because there's still a question of whether or not Nixon broke the law. And should Nixon maybe serve jail, right? That's kind of the question here. Well, with this pardon from Ford, and a pardon, if you're not familiar, presidents and governors have the power to pardon certain criminals. So, to get them out of jail or make sure they don't face certain crimes. And so what Gerald Ford did was he said, no, Richard Nixon is not going to face any additional time. According to Gerald Ford, our long national nightmare is over. And according to Gerald Ford, it was time for the country to move on. Again, Richard Nixon is the first and only president to resign from the office, and it was because he was trying to, or not just because he was trying to, because he used the CIA to cover up, his criminal behavior. So, one of the long-lasting, consequences of the Watergate scandal is Nixon's downfall. Again, it's not just the downfall of Nixon personally. That's true, but it also is in some respect, and combine this with the War Powers Act, the downfall of the presidency in general, right? Congress is kind of reasserting itself over the executive branch that has grown so strong. But what does this say about trust in the national government? And you combine this with the loss in Vietnam, the lies that were told about the Vietnam War, what Americans saw on TV, what they were hearing from their politicians. And then you have a guy like Richard Nixon who very clearly was lying to cover his own behavior, who was spying on the opposite political party. The Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War completely erode Americans' trust in their institutions and in their government. Section 6, Deindustrialization and the Rise of the Sunbelt. So, the declining economy of the 1970s was in part a result of OPEC and the subsequent energy crisis. But that wasn't the only thing. In fact, the American economy was going through a pretty profound transformation. And one of the transformations is deindustrialization. And what we essentially mean by deindustrialization is the decline of American industry. Industry, and we'll just add manufacturing. The American economy was strong in the 1950s, the affluent period, and much of it relied on producing things. The United States was the great arsenal of democracy during World War II, and following that conflict, American factories were left in pretty good shape still, and so they continued to the United States continued to lead the world in terms of manufacturing and output. But by the 1970s, the United States is it's becoming less of a manufacturing power. And in the very beginning of this chapter, we saw an image of an abandoned factory in Detroit. Here we have an abandoned factory in Ohio, and the United States is, losing a lot of this manufacturing capability. So, what are some reasons as to why this happened? Well, our textbook provides us with three things here. So, the first one is that local governments, and on the level, local governments wanted things like what we say, housing and office space instead of factories. So, on the local level, with local politics, factories really weren't on high priority as far as new projects were concerned. Another one is the changing technology, or as it's called, mechanization. And increasingly, as technology improved, and especially consider the Cold War and the amount of research and development and spending that is going to the advancement of technology, in a very straightforward manner, machines replaced workers, or at least machines could replace workers. So, why hire an industrial worker when you can have some sort of sophisticated machine essentially do the work for you? And the one that gave rise to, or at least also contributed to the image that you see here, is that many businesses simply just relocated, right? Moved to places that were more business friendly, that didn't have as many regulations, that had maybe like a lower minimum wage or something like that, more profitable. And, this could be overseas or to the Sunbelt. The Sunbelt, we'll talk about what the Sunbelt is here in a moment, but businesses relocated, we'll just say for taxes, less regulation, more profit. And a perfect example of this deindustrialization taking place right before the eyes of Americans was the city of Detroit. This had been the center of American car production in the 1950s and 1960s. Detroit was a major city, not just in the United States, but even in terms of the global economy. It was the center of the American auto industry, and it was home to a lot of jobs and prosperity during the war. But from the 1940s into the 1970s, Detroit was in a very serious decline. So, for example, just in Detroit, the number of firms, manufacturing firms, that is businesses, in 1947 there was 3,000. That was knocked down to 2,000. In terms of jobs, there were about 340,000 jobs in Detroit in 1947. That had been knocked down to 150,000. 2 years here. This is 1977. And this is 1947. So the before and after. So you can see it unfolding before your eyes. And one point to make about the decline of the economy in the 1970s is that it doesn't affect all Americans equally. There certainly were racial disparities. So, for example, again, in Detroit, 20% unemployment For Black workers, it was 6% unemployment. For white workers. So earlier, when we had mentioned things like the riots that happened in Detroit in 1967, how the pie is too damn high. Um, this was, we could see firsthand in cities like Detroit how the impact of the economy can affect the population. And, Detroit since then has become maybe the prime example of a city that really thrived in the 50s and 60s, but from the 70s, 80s, and onwards has been a city that really struggled. And again, maybe is the greatest symbol of this deindustrialization that is taking place. Now, as American manufacturing firms are in decline, and as the American economy is changing, it's really going from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. In fact, today, most of our economy is actually not making things. We don't make things at the same degree that we made things in the past. It's more about services. That also coincided with the decline of unions. We might also call this the quote unquote assault on unions. And recall that, when FDR was president, this was, he was a very pro union president. There were a lot of protections for unions under FDR. But after World War II, unions, labor unions, are also in slow and steady decline. And we also have three reasons that we can attribute to the decline in unions. One is that unions sought more cooperation, so a change in cooperation, a change in strategy rather than struggle, rather than going on strike like they did in the past in some earlier time periods. And, this made unions, because they were willing to cooperate with businesses, right? It, made unions, you might say, more, like distant, prone to corruption, prone to bureaucracy, uh, bureauc, Bureau, bureaucratic, more out of touch, right, as far as unions were concerned. The second reason was politics. Politics had changed. I don't think this is something that we explicitly mentioned, but earlier during the time of FDR, FDR was part of the Democratic Party, part of the Progressive Party. They would have represented what might be called the old left. Now, the term old left is actually not a real term, but it might be helpful to understand here. And this was a type of progressivism that was concerned primarily with the working class, a shift in what was now the new left. The new left was a type of politics that were not so much concerned with workers, right? This was more about things like civil rights, anti-war, pro-environment. They weren't as concerned with the working class. In fact, there's this shift in liberalism, or the shift in the Democratic Party, or the shift in the Progressive Party in the United States, where the party goes much more towards rights than it is for things like minimum wage or some of those other things. We might say a shift in the new left, civil rights, anti-war, pro-environment, left unions behind. Right? The Democrats could not be counted on as being as pro-union or pro-worker as they could in the past under FDR, right? And again, so because the new left emerges in the 60s, you can sometimes refer to the Democratic Party under FDR as the old left, although we don't really actually use that term. And then a feature that plagued the labor movement in the United States, and pretty much plagued every movement in the United States, was racism. Hate strikes and the inability for the working class to unite based off of race also just prevented unions from being as successful as they possibly could. So hate strikes, these were strikes of white workers when black workers were hired. And some of the largest strikes in American history were strikes of people refusing to work not for higher pay, not for more vacation, not for safer conditions. Some of the biggest strikes in American history were people going on strike because the factory hired black workers and white workers didn't want to work with them. So, if unions could solve the problem of racism within their ranks, then perhaps they'd be in a better position or be better poised to get the types of things that they wanted from the workplace. So, the decline in American industry is coincided with a decline in unions and the strength of the working class. Now, as far as the impact that deindustrialization had in terms of the layout of the country, um, the manufacturing center of the United States was the Midwest, but because many of those factories were closing, after that, from the 1970s onwards, this part of the country is sometimes referred to as the Rust Belt to signify the fact that there are so many factories there that had been abandoned and they're just sitting there rusting to these to this day. So the Rust Belt is, we'll call it the Midwest, the Midwest. So places like Michigan and Ohio are abandoned American manufacturing is. And people moved from the Rust Belt because if that's where all the jobs were, well, of course, everyone's going to move there. Well, when all the jobs, when all those factories were abandoned, when they were either built overseas or built in the Sunbelt, that meant that people would move to different parts of the country. And so there was a Sunbelt migration. The Sunbelt, this is the states where the sun shines. It is effectively California through Texas. So you go from Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico to Texas, all the way to Florida. And not only did people and businesses moved to the Sun Belt, in the 1960s, 70s, and really beyond. So much so that it used to be the case that states like Michigan and Ohio, those are some of the more populated states in the country. And so when it came to things like the Electoral College, for example, um, you can count on states in Michigan having more votes for the Electoral College for the president because they had a bigger population. Well, now the biggest states are California, Texas. Textbook mentions that by 1972. And again, this term Rust Belt, it is kind of, it is poking fun a little bit at the economic changes that had occurred in the Midwest. So it's not something that Midwesterners would probably proudly say about themselves. Nobody would probably say, "Oh, I live in the Rust Belt," because it is kind of a sad history in terms of the way that American manufacturing declined. So it's kind of used in order to point out this negative aspect of the United States. But Rust Belt versus Sun Belt by 1972, more people had lived in the Sun Belt now, and that was a pattern that only continued into the future. Section 7, the politics of love, sex, and gender. So during the 1960s and 1970s, it's said that a sexual revolution took place in the United States. We'll go ahead and define the sexual revolution as during the 1960s and 70s. It was a protest against sexual and gender norms of the 1950s. And the sexual revolution was tied to some of the things that we had mentioned in an earlier chapter that were already kind of changing undercurrents in American society. One of them was the emergence of the hippies and the counterculture. And the hippies already had a little bit different views on sex than the mass culture of the 1950s. Recall that the slogan often associated with the hippies is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So there's already some momentum for the sexual revolution here. And the second one was the feminist movement or feminism that we talked about earlier that really began to attack and challenge the type of cultural stereotypes that surrounded women. So both of these things help contribute to a much larger sexual revolution or changing opinions about sex in American society. If we want to kind of define it or make it a little bit more simple, we could say that the sexual revolution was much more about sex for pleasure, not for family, right? Not for family or not to create a family. Now, in the 1950s, it wasn't just the culture that enforced certain sexual behaviors, it was also the laws. So, for example, and this depended state by state, but there were laws that made things illegal, such as interracial marriage, laws that had banned homosexuality, and laws that had banned things like cross dressing. So sexuality was this thing that, on the one hand, it was considered very private and intimate, and one didn't speak about it all that openly, right? It was taboo to talk about it. But at the same time, it was very public in the sense that there were laws on the books that, regulated it or, legislated it. Now, in terms of the sexual revolution, there were some, pretty important changes that took place in American society. One of them was the decision by the Supreme Court of Roe versus Wade in 1973, and this was Supreme Court ruling that protected abortion, woman's right to an abortion, that protected abortion, we'll say under, what is it, the privacy, the quote unquote right to privacy. And we'll talk about this in a later chapter, but really, when we think about the quote unquote culture wars in American history, right? What sort of, and again, culture, attitudes, beliefs, stereotypes, ideas, this is what we mean by culture. Culture wars being the way that Americans disagree about, how we should behave, what our morality ought to be. Abortion is really at the center. It's probably, amongst the culture war issues historically, at least from the 70s all the way up into the present day. It's probably the most contested topic in the United States. And in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that women are, their right to an abortion is protected. Another way in which we might say the idea about gender and sexuality changed was when Title VII was added to the Civil Rights Act. Now, recall, by this point, hopefully, we should all know what the Civil Rights Act is. This was a law that protected or banned discrimination based off of race, color, religion, national origin. Title VII added sex to the list of protected categories in the Civil Rights Act. So, the fact that discrimination was made illegal in terms of race, color, religion, national origin, women would be guaranteed the same types of protection, right? That sex would also be added as one of those protected categories. Another change is the way in which divorce laws changed. No fault divorce became more popular, actually became, we'll say, the standard. by the 1980s. And no fault divorce, meant one did not need a reason for divorce. This allowed people to get out of their marriages, not like they did not like in the past. And it had a pretty profound effect, the shift to no fault divorce. In the 1950s, divorce was, I don't think your textbook actually provides a specific statistic, but it was very low, right? 2%, 5%, divorces were not common in the 1950s. Part of that was because you needed a reason to get a divorce. No fault divorce allowed people to simply just claim what they called irreconcilable differences, right? You can just go to a judge, say, oh, we got irreconcilable differences, and bada bing, bada boom, you could get a divorce. By the 1980s, about 50% of all marriages are ending in divorce. So divorce rates also increase, and this is a shift from the past. And the change to no fault divorce laws, or the popularity of them, was one of the reasons in this transition. Now, amongst the various types of, we might say, public displays of the sexual revolution, the emergence of the gay rights movement in the late 1960s and in the 1970s is probably the best example of this. We'll say about gay rights, like a lot of the other social activism that unfolded during the 1970s, it was inspired by civil rights and other social activism. A lot of this has to do with identity-based activism. How does one's identity shape the rights and privileges that are afforded to various people in American society? And so, the gay rights movement during the gay rights movement started or began. We typically cite the Stonewall Inn Uprising as the beginning of the gay rights movement. So, the Stonewall Inn Uprising. This was when the Stonewall Inn. This was a bar, a popular a bar was raided by the police. The patrons fought back. And we consider this is the start of the gay rights movement. Typically, we associate the Stonewall Inn Uprising with the beginning of that. I want to say 1969. I might be getting that year. Yeah, 1969. That was the year that it occurred. And so a lot of the gay rights movement, in terms of its early types of activism, a lot of it was concerned with simply encouraging people to be public and not be afraid or ashamed of their sexual orientation or their identity. And so the quote unquote come out movement, or to quote unquote come out of the closet, encouraged people to be public and open with their sexual identity. Later fights over things like marriage and equal access to healthcare, some of those things are a little bit later down the road. But starting in the 1970s, a lot of the gay rights movement focused on this idea of coming out, right? Come out of the closet, be public, and don't hide your identity. And there was some success, we might say, as far as the gay rights movement goes. So, for example, by the 1980s, homosexuality was no longer a mental illness. Earlier, I think this was actually maybe in the mid 1970s, where was it the American Psychiatric Association or Psychological Association, whatever the organization is that determines what's a mental illness and what isn't. They decided that it was no longer a mental illness, and this was in part due to the type of activism that emerged after the Stonewall Inn. Well, the sexual revolution was met by a reaction against it, and there was an entire segment of the American population that saw the sexual revolution as a bad thing for American society. Um, these are the moral conservatives. All right, the moral conservatives, they opposed the sexual revolution. They wanted to go back to an earlier time in the 1950s and instill those sexual values on American society. One of the leaders was Jerry Falwell. He'll say a leader of moral conservatism. And what becomes known as the religious right. And we'll talk about in a later chapter the way in which the right wing or the Republican side of the political spectrum ends up adopting a lot of the messaging that comes from the moral conservatives and people like Jerry Falwell. So, for example, Falwell states on the sexual revolution, he says, quote, "It is now time to take a stand on certain moral issues. We stand against the Equal Rights Amendment," which we'll talk about here, "the feminist revolution, and the homosexual revolution. We must have a renewal in this country," Jerry Falwell. As far as the women's movement, second women's movement, or feminist movement is concerned, really the climax of that movement was the ERA, which stands for the Equal Rights Amendment. And even though the feminist movement had accomplished a lot in terms of Roe versus Wade and getting Title VII passed to the ERA, so women have better access to jobs. There was also things like college admissions that were taken down. The ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, would be a constitutional amendment that would take what was put in the Civil Rights Act and place it into the U.S. Constitution. So this would be an amendment to the Constitution that would, quote, see, that equal rights, I'll just equality rights under law will not be denied by U.S. or any state count of sex. So it was essentially taking, Title VII of the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was putting that as a constitutional amendment. And again, recall, we haven't talked about this in a while, but the difference between a law and an amendment. So, for example, we had in the case of civil rights, we have a law in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but we also have the 14th Amendment, and the amendments are much stronger, right? They're much permanent, they're much more concrete. So, what was effectively already law, those in favor of the feminist movement and the sexual revolution, and those who wanted to make it more permanent, had pushed for an amendment, the ERA. But for them, they were met by opposition. Another leader of the moral conservative wing was Phyllis Schlafly, who established Stop ERA. She is a leader of moral conservatives. Wanted to stop ERA from passing. Now, early on, the ERA actually picked up quite a bit of momentum and had a lot of support behind Congress. In 1972, Congress passed ERA. In 1977, 35 states ratified. Now remember, when it comes to an amendment, it requires 66% of Congress and 75% of states. If you're going to change the Constitution, there really needs to be a high bar, right? Almost every single state needs to approve. So by 1977, I think they only needed three more, uh, to pass that. But the Stop ERA movement and Phyllis Schlafly had successfully campaigned against the amendment, so much so to the point that by 1982, ERA expired and was not added to the Constitution. Section 8, the Misery Index. 1976 was an election year, and the two candidates were Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford had only come to the presidency because of Nixon's resignation, but he was the Republican. And he'd only served for a short time because he was going to serve out the rest of Nixon's term. So I don't even think it was more than 2 years. But his pardon of Nixon did not sit very well with Americans. And Gerald Ford, who had been a politician, was also tied with the rest of American politics at the time. The 1976 election found a very unique candidate, and that was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was running for the Democratic ticket. He was, at the time described as a peanut farmer from Georgia, but he ran for president in 1976 with a very simple but very effective message. And that was he ran on a quote unquote, I will not lie to you. And given the recent history of the United States, especially politically, right? Given Vietnam, given Watergate, the trust in American government was at an all-time low. And so here comes a peanut farmer from Georgia who's not really established with politics. So that's one of the appeals to him. And he says, look, I will not lie to you. He is the honest politician. And Jimmy Carter wins the election of 1976. So he's this completely outside, non-political sort of guy that at the end of the day, his honesty actually ends up being somewhat of a detriment to his presidency. Jimmy Carter, who I don't know why they included this picture, but a little bit funny. These are, I guess, supporters of Jimmy Carter who are, have some pretty hilarious looking pumpkins that look like him. But Jimmy Carter's presidency was one that was very troubled, almost from the get-go. And the United States economy continued to decline and really became a sticking point for a lot of Americans. And without getting too much into the complicated measures of the decline of the economy, we can just simply list 5 things. We'll just sort of list these things 1 through 5 for why the United States economy continued to decline. Some of these things we've already mentioned before, but we'll just put it all together here. One is the cost of the Vietnam. The Vietnam War itself, cost billions of dollars, but there was also going to be billions of dollars in the foreseeable future that were handed out in terms of veteran benefits. And that's one of the things that might sometimes be overlooked when we look at the cost of the war is how much did it actually cost for the veterans of the war to be, to be paid and be taken care of, especially with conditions like PTSD. In fact, if you go back to the American Civil War and you look at the national budget in, the years after the American Civil War, is like almost half of the national budget was paying veterans of the Civil War for their service and the damages that were done. Vietnam War was very expensive and would continue to be expensive as long as the survivors of the war continued to, have the struggles that they did. The second reason we know this, the oil shocks, right? OPEC. This did not make the economy any better. A third thing that we really haven't talked about all that much, but is somewhat related to an earlier chapter, was the rebuilding of countries like Germany and Japan. The United States certainly had a vested interest in making sure that Cold War allies like West Germany, like Japan, that they had strong and stable economies after the Cold War in order to prevent communism. But oftentimes this came at the cost of the US. We'll say at the cost of the US. Perhaps the United States should have been focusing more of the rebuilding effort at home in the United States rather than overseas. The fourth reason is trade deficits, right? Trade deficits. And simply this just means that other nations could and did sell in the US tariff-free, meaning that countries like Germany and Japan could sell their stuff in the United States, and not even just Germany and Japan, but any other country could sell their stuff in the United States tariff-free. They didn't have to pay additional taxes, but the US was subject to tariffs, meaning that we had a hard time selling in their country, right? If we wanted to sell something in their country, they put a tax on us. But if they sold it in our country, we didn't put a tax on them. And so when we think about a trade deficit, it typically means in terms of imports and exports. Now, remember, really ever since World War I, really, the United States was primarily an exporting nation. We made stuff, other people bought stuff. By the 1970s, we are importing way more than we're exporting, right? So it means that imports are greater than exports, and that doesn't put American manufacturing in a very good position. The last thing, but we talked about just the last section, deindustrialization. So whatever point that you want to use for why the economy was terrible in the 1970s, at the very least, your textbook does mention these 5 things as all contributing to the economic downturn. Now, for as complicated as the economy is, if you're sitting in the United States in 1976, this is the guy that's in charge. And so Jimmy Carter, because the economy continues to flounder, he is going to get all the negative pushback, and he's going to be responsible, right? Captain of the ship is responsible regardless of, the weather. So continuing throughout the 1970s, there were various economic measures that we could use to determine the dire situation of the economy. Stagflation was very characteristic of the time period. In fact, when you use the term stagflation even today, you're usually referring to the 1970s. Stagflation is high inflation. Inflation is when your money doesn't buy anything. So we typically say that a measure of inflation is when prices go up, but it's technically not prices that are going up, it's that your money is going down, right? So you can't buy as many things. So it's high inflation plus high unemployment. So just one of these things is bad enough, right? If you have high inflation, that means that your money isn't buying anything. That's bad. High unemployment, you can't find a job. That's also bad. What's worse is when they happen at the same time. And when they happen at the same time, we call that stagflation. Economists use something called the misery index, and this was a measure of inflation and unemployment. And this was something that continued to increase during the 1970s, increased in the 1970s. And I think if you use the misery index, I think the 1970s might actually be worse than the Great Depression. Because in the Great Depression, there was high unemployment, but there wasn't high inflation. But during the 1970s, it was high unemployment and high inflation. So that was a matter that was very much, in some ways, worse. The image that we see here, this is a line for gasoline during the energy crisis in 1979. This one, gas stations ran out of gas. And, in some cases, various local governments had gas rationing programs. So they might make something where you can only fill up your tank of gas if your license plate ended with like an even or odd number, depending on what day it was. So people would get in line for gas at like 8 in the morning, and then maybe by noon they'd be lucky to fill up their gas tank. That's how bad the economy could have been. So economically and domestically, Carter continues to struggle. In terms of foreign policy, things aren't much better for the Carter presidency. Jimmy Carter, quote, wanted a policy based off of constant decency and its values on optimism in our historic vision. And that's a good way to look at Jimmy Carter. In fact, we might even say that Carter's foreign policy was pretty much based on human rights. So, in some sense, he did want to continue a little bit of the detente that Richard Nixon had started to relax the tension. And early on in Carter's presidency, he did have some important accomplishments that signaled to the rest of the world that the United States was going to approach foreign policy less militaristically, right? More based off the rights of humans. So, for example, one was in the case of the Panama Canal. Now, if you remember all the way back in the era of imperialism, the United States constructed the Panama Canal against the will of Colombia, helped to incite a secessionist movement by Panama, and then built the canal mostly to serve the interests of the United States. And so this was maybe an example of the United States having a quote unquote bad neighbor policy in Latin America. Well, Jimmy Carter negotiated, we'll say Carter gave the canal back to Panama. And this was, again, you could say the practicality, what was the consequences of this in real time? Probably not too much. The United States would still have a very strong presence in the Panama Canal, but this was a symbol of, goodwill by the United States. This was an example of how Carter wanted to have a decent foreign policy, or a foreign policy led by decency. And there might have been no other place in the world that needed more attention to the case of human rights than the Middle East. And Carter also attempted to tackle the problem in the Middle East. And recall, we'd mentioned this a little bit earlier with the OPEC crisis, but Israel had gone to war with their Arab neighbors 1948, 1967, 1973. And so what Carter had attempted to do was to create peace in the Middle East. And so he established the Camp David Accords. And these were a series of negotiations between Israel and really the leading Arab nation, which was Egypt. So these were negotiations between Israel and Egypt, and actually succeeded. They accomplished a land for recognition exchange. Now, by no means was the Camp David Accords an ending to the violence and conflict in the Middle East. It's only, every 5 or, not even 5 years, every 2 or 5 years, we're reminded of that. But essentially, what it meant was that Egypt became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel and Israel gave back conquered land. During these wars, Israel was victorious in each and every one of them. In one of the wars, I forget exactly which one it was, but Israel had taken pretty decent amount of land from Egypt in the war. And so this exchange was Egypt would recognize Israel as a legitimate country. Israel would give back the land that they conquered. And at least for the time being, Carter could look back and say, this was an accomplishment in terms of trying to build a more optimistic world. The problem for Carter and his human rights based foreign policy and a policy of decency and a policy of optimism is that the rest of the world really didn't allow for it to happen. And there were two events in particular that would force the United States into a more aggressive position as far as foreign policy is concerned. The first one happened in Iran, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The Iranian Revolution was when the Shah, we'll call him the pro-US ruler in Iran, was forced out by a revolution. The revolution itself is, again, the Shah was in charge of Iran prior to the Iran Revolution. But after the revolution, it was an Islamic theocratic government that eventually took power. So we might say an Islamic government got rid of the pro-US regime. And, the Shah was, kind of like No Din Diem in Vietnam. He was an important American ally, but the Shah wasn't incredibly popular among the Iranian people. And it wasn't just the Islamic faction. Eventually it's the kind of more religious conservative faction that eventually does take control. But there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Shah for reasons of, maybe actually supporting communism, being anti-capitalist, for being against imperialism, seeing the Shah as, as a U.S. puppet. So in the same way that, Americans or the United States had supported, for example, the pro-U.S. regime in Cuba, the No Din Diem regime in Vietnam, supported the Shah's regime in Iran, there were a combination of forces that led to anti-American opposition. Some of them may be related to communism, but some of them not. And what's fascinating about the Iranian Revolution is that, at the time, the Cold War is still going on. And, the United States is still more or less concerned about communism above everything else. But there's something else going on in the world, not just in Iran, but something else going on that the United States is not quite, it's more obvious today. The United States wasn't quite, quite keen on seeing what was actually transpiring. So this was bad news for Carter, right? The fact that you had this pro-U.S. regime that was ousted. Now, it wasn't quite the same thing as containing communism. The United States didn't know quite what to make of what happened in Iran, but it certainly wasn't good. It was only made worse when, during the Iranian Revolution, Americans in Iran were held hostage, or captured and taken hostage. It sparked off a hostage crisis in Iran. These were 52 Americans were taken hostage for 444 days during the Iranian Revolution. And so the question before Carter is not only how do you lose Iran, so the United States has lost a strategic area in Iran, but what are you going to do about the hostages? And Carter attempted and failed a rescue mission. And not only did the rescue mission fail in apprehending the hostages, 8 U.S. servicemen died. They were supposed to be part of a helicopter rescue mission. The helicopter got caught in a sandstorm. It crashed, and 8 Americans died trying to save the hostages. The regime in Iran, they were upset, all the more upset that Carter had tried to secretly rescue the hostages without sort of any type of negotiation. So they were not willing to speak to Carter. Americans continued to question Carter. When are they going to get the hostages back? The fact that people had died during the failed rescue mission. So it was just a complete disaster as far as foreign policy goes. So the revolution in Iran was one way in which Carter was not able to follow this policy of human rights. It became clear for most Americans that the United States needed to be more aggressive with places like Iran. That was coupled with what had happened in Afghanistan. And I want to say it was the same year, 1979. Maybe it was 1978, but we'll just say, see if I had to guess, 1979. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And so Carter's kind of more relaxed, or even just the policy of detente, was very much being seen as opening up a vacuum in the world for the Soviet Union to fill, and Afghanistan was exactly that. And so Carter himself eventually did have to abandon this human rights or this policy based on decency. He eventually advocated the Carter Doctrine. This was, in some sense, to abandon a foreign policy of decency and be more aggressive. The Carter Doctrine stated the U.S. would send troops to the Middle East if necessary. If necessary. The invasion of Afghanistan, in the long run, it actually proved to be quite beneficial to the United States because the Soviets got bogged down in a conflict that, was in a lot of ways like the war in Vietnam. In fact, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan is sometimes called the Vietnam or the Soviet Union. That is a long, drawn out, costly war with no clear measure of victory that lasts for 10 years. And eventually the Soviets have to abandon Afghanistan without installing or protecting communism, which is what they wanted to do in that in region. So the Carter presidency was troubled domestically for the economy, was troubled in terms of foreign policy because of what was going on in Iran and Afghanistan at the time. And Carter, for the honest broker that he was, and again, say what you want about Jimmy Carter, he was a humanitarian, he was an honest guy. He told Americans straight up about the dire situation, and telling Americans the truth about how bad things are and how bad things are going to get doesn't make you a popular president. But people want to be told everything's going to be okay. And Carter's honesty, he was almost too honest, and he gave a speech that would be described as a crisis of confidence. And by the end of the 1970s, the unraveling had taken place. There was a crisis of confidence. Things did not look good for the country. Jimmy Carter said, quote, in 1979, I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. Jimmy Carter, 1979.